Michael Moore gets crucified for doing some research on green energy. Canadians still believe that paying a tax will change the weather. And Elizabeth May is Elizabeth May. This is Canada Now. I'm Greg Wycliffe. Iconic filmmaker Michael Moore endorsed a new documentary last month. Moore is known for his hard-hitting progressive documentaries. However, this new film, Planet of the Humans, was critical of a staple of progressive politics: the green energy movement. Immediately after its release, the progressive mob viciously denounced the film, whining like a bunch of 4-year-olds who want their toy back. There were some thoughtful environmentalists who did take the time to break down the film's valid and invalid criticisms, but everybody else grabbed their pitchforks, calling for the outright ban of the film and demanding Michael Moore be burned at the stake. In this case, burning biomass was absolutely justified. Grifters of the green energy movement and so-called experts were calling the film dangerous, full of lies, and controversial. Why is the information in this film so controversial? Well, it makes references to reality. And as we all know, reality does not mix well with the fairy tale narrative that they use to try and sell us utopian garbage. The film makes the case that solar and wind energy still has a ways to go before being a feasible replacement for fossil fuels. It goes on to explain the massive amount of fossil fuels it takes to mine, build, and maintain these renewable technologies. This was disappointing news for devout followers of the green religion. Despite what their high priests and priestesses have been preaching, apparently completely transforming our energy infrastructure and our way of life is not as simple as the three little pigs. You don't have to look far in Canada to see examples of renewable energy failures. Last month, the provincial government of Nova Scotia wrote off a $48 million investment in failed wind tower manufacturing. Why? Well, after 2 years, there were no sales. No sales? That's weird, because the bourgeoisie environmentalists tell me there's lots of people in the market for 300 feet tall, 56-ton wind turbines. Are you telling me all these Canadian peasants just want a working furnace and a tank of gas? They probably don't even have the new iPhone. Puh. Another critique of the green energy movement is that it's largely supported by government subsidies. In other words, the natural market forces of supply and demand don't exist. They're created artificially by government subsidies. And when this happens, as Michael Moore's film points out, massive organizations that already make billions of dollars and are already responsible for lots of pollution swoop in to pick up those fat, green government subsidy checks. 'Cause, well, the environment, you guys. Okay, Enbridge, if you say so. This is exactly what's happened in Ontario. According to an analysis by the Consumer Policy Institute, 90% of a $1.9 billion green energy subsidy has gone to only 11 different massive corporations. Meanwhile, the price of hydro has gone up for everybody in Ontario. Why does the rich get richer and the poor get poorer? The environment, you guys. And you might say, Greg, Shell and Chevron, they're going green, they're cleaning up their act. Didn't you see that Al Gore documentary? Listen, if you don't think there's a lot of money to be made manipulating scientific research as it pertains to the energy industry, the one industry that directly and indirectly profits off of all human behavior, well, you're just adorable. At the end of Michael Moore's film, he alluded to part of the solution to be population control. Too many kids, too many people. Many bloodthirsty climate activists agree with this point. You see, when it comes to population control, these communists are hoping food shortages, poverty, and a deadly virus might just do the trick. It's crazy how quickly granola-eating hippies can start to sound like Hitler. Speaking of creepy Europeans that make your skin crawl, Greta Thunberg was in the news again. The most trusted name in news, CNN. They had a panel on the coronavirus, and since they're such a prestigious news organization, they had to pick the very best for the panel. In this case, a terrified autistic child with an anxiety disorder.
Well, I mean, first of all, we still haven't gotten tested.
My heart goes out to everyone who has to deal with anxiety disorders and mental illness, but it's the people that prey upon them that I can't stand. I mean, CNN follows Greta around with a camera like Harvey Weinstein's lackeys follow young starlets around with big movie contracts. In other news, earlier this month, former Green Party leader, Elizabeth May, was excited to talk about the global pandemic and how it's actually an opportunity for the green energy movement. With her nuance, grace, and singular dimension, Elizabeth May made the stunning and brave announcement, oil is dead.
So basically you're saying oil is dead.
Oil is dead.
Many Canadians retorted, asking Mrs. May, "Are you sure you're not talking about your political career?" But she backed up her bold statements with a study that predicts renewable energy will make up 30% of energy production around the world. When questioned how much of that other 70% would be fossil fuels, Elizabeth started pouring a glass of wine and talking about the amazing benefits of healing crystals. When then asked how much oil and gas products will be needed in Canada to develop more solar and wind infrastructure, she started paying compliments to a former Al-Qaeda child soldier.
Welcome back, Omar Khadr. Omar Khadr, you got more class than the whole fucking cabinet. Thank you.
And to be fair, when you're ideologically possessed, questions and percentages can be tricky. For example, one study shows that the casual environmentalist is made up of 30% wishful thinking and 70% delusion. But are we really surprised by this? Elizabeth May is like a kindergarten teacher. She based her entire political career on a color. I don't want to be the one to terrorize her fairy tale by pointing out that nearly every item in her home was brought to her in some part by fossil fuels. I don't want to be the villain to ruin her day while she sips her tea stoned out of her mind looking out at the ocean. I don't want to take that innocence away. That'd be like telling a child Santa Claus doesn't exist. That'd be like telling a Canadian that paying a tax doesn't change the weather. That'd be like telling an environmentalist how their hiking gear and environmentally friendly water bottle was made. That's like telling a vegan what happens to rabbits when they sneak onto the carrot farm. That'd be like telling school kids protesting about the climate and CO2 how plants grow. Are they still teaching photosynthesis, by the way? And finally, it'd be like talking to protesters who say we need to stop all those CO2 emissions and tell them where food comes from. Still waiting to hear from Tesla if they're working on those solar-powered tractors. And listen, I am all for making an effort to phase off of fossil fuels and developing and implementing these technologies when they make sense. But you got to admit, when someone's suggesting that instead of a pipeline, we load up oil tankers that's powered by Bunker C fuel, ship them through the Panama Canal all the way around the continent to refine it on the East Coast, it sounds kind of retarded. But one man's mental deficiency is another man's opportunity.
We presently buy large part of our oil from Western Canada.
I think tar sands are condemned.
Do not invest any more of those billions of dollars into tar sands because there's no future. We will need some oil for the coming years. And I'm not saying you have to stop everything. I never said anything like that.
Listening to a politician's explanation of why they don't use oil anymore is a lot like listening to a cokehead's explanation of how they don't use cocaine anymore. Yeah, man, I've totally been cutting back. I don't need that crap anymore. Really? Because you keep disappearing into the bathroom, repeating the same story that doesn't make any sense, and I'm finding these baggies with little white residue in them, and we consume 90 million barrels of oil a day still around the world during this lockdown. Yeah, but that's like a 10% decrease, man. Okay, consumer.
Oil sands.
And don't get me wrong, I would love to still be reading along and enjoying the green energy fairy tale. I would love to believe that green energy will save the world tomorrow. Cokeheads don't exist. Budgets balance themselves. Greedy corporations aren't indoctrinating me with globalist propaganda. There are no world leaders waging deadly wars over oil and resources. But the reason I had to close the book on this fairy tale is the constant foreshadowing of communism. I mean, the Disney version has a very happy ending, but something tells me the one in real life will not.
Don't put money in fossil fuels at all to try to bail them out. It won't work.
We need to make good investments that allow people to have long-term, sustainable, good jobs.
Tar sands won't be back. Contrary
to what agenda-driven narcissists might have to say, oil is not dead in Canada. It's being killed. It's being put down by the same people who coincidentally don't believe in the death penalty, and by political parties that coincidentally don't have one seat in parliament in the province of Alberta. And because of Alberta's oil reserves, Quebec has received over $200 billion in equalization payments since the 1960s. But why try to cooperate and have respect for the rest of the country when you can exploit it and passive-aggressively say you're going to leave like an abusive boyfriend?
We get oil from Alberta. We pay for it. They don't give us any special price, so they should thank us.
And let's not forget, back in December 2019, Calgary was already in an economic crisis. Unemployment had reached a record high of 20% among young men. You see, even before this lockdown pandemic, these young men were already stuck inside with their dick in their hands. And that wasn't because of a deadly virus. No, that was because of a hostile federal government. And based on the non-binary, eunuch energy of liberal policymakers, I guess these young men should be grateful. Grateful that it was the oil and gas industry that was neutered, and not them.
So they should thank us.
And when it comes to the oil in our country, Canada is very well endowed. We're home to 1/3 of the world's oil reserves, but we're being forced to sell 99% of it to the US at a loss. Why? Because Canada has a limited pipeline capacity. Why do we have a limited pipeline capacity? Two reasons for this. Number one is Bill C-69. Although this bill sounds sexy, it's anything but. Basically, if Canada wants to lace a pipe, the foreplay is no longer working over materials, greasing up nuts and bolts, and breaking a sweat. No, now the foreplay with Bill C-69 is considering the intersection of sex and gender with other identity factors. Whew. It's getting hot in here. Even lawyers who usually get off on sifting through legal jargon were disgusted by this bill. And speaking of disgusted, while this clown introduces these virtue signaling policies that cripple our oil and gas industry, he's still importing oil from slave owners. Yes, lovely places like Saudi Arabia where women are still treated like slaves. Not the kinky consensual kind either. Despite how abhorrent that is, I'm sure there's many naive Canadians who are still saying, well, the Alberta tar sands are dirty. It's one of the dirtiest types of oil, Greg. You're moving the goalposts. I'm not going to deny the impact that the oil sands are having on its local environment. But also, let's not disregard and disrespect the many hardworking Canadian engineers trying to make the operation as clean as possible. Because, I mean, think about it. Compared to the rest of the world, Canada is already one of the cleanest places. Why, as Canadians, do we only ever hear about how awful the tar sands are? Pipelines are evil. Us horrible Canadians in our big, cold country, heating our homes and driving our cars. What monsters we are. That's all we ever hear about. And that leads me to reason number two, why Canada has a limited pipeline capacity. U.S. foundations fund activism in Canada, messaging in Canada against the Canadian oil and gas industry. It's called the Tar Sands Campaign, and it's funded by the Rockefeller Brothers Fund. If you follow the money, you'll see there's very obvious reasons why that's all we ever hear about is the evil tar sands. Wow, the U.S., money from the U.S., the same country exploiting our oil and gas industry because we don't have a pipeline? I guess that explains why these protesters don't care at all about the pipelines running into our homes, but the ones that make our country more prosperous and benefits our economy in every feasible way? Yeah, let's protest those pipelines. Bonk, bonk. And I just wanted to add, I'm sure many people protesting against Canadian pipelines have the best of intentions. And if you're one of those people watching, I want to give you a big congratulations, because by protesting against Canadian pipelines, you're helping American billionaires, you're helping America grow jobs, and you are single-handedly helping the American oil and gas industry. So while you deny the inevitability of oil coming out of the ground to protect a tiny strip of land, you're also preventing much-needed jobs from growing in Canada's rural communities. You're helping Canada's unemployment rate go up, and the value of our Canadian dollar go down. How does it feel to be a perfect little soldier for the American oil and gas industry? What's that? You don't even like America and Donald Trump? Well, maybe if you stopped obsessing over American news and cared to follow what actually happens in the country you live in, you wouldn't feel like such an ass right now. For the uninformed, unaware, or flat-out indoctrinated Canadian who doesn't know what I'm talking about, there's a short, well-researched documentary on this topic called Over a Barrel. The sinister story of foreign influence enslaving our most profitable Canadian industry has never once been covered by CBC Docs or CBC News, ever. Shameful, pathetic, grossly un-Canadian waste of our tax dollars, and I can't even find the words for this one, but you can guarantee whenever I hear a sweet voice of a CBC announcer, I put another hole in my wall. But Greg, you haven't talked about climate change. What about climate change? Are you a climate change denier? Don't you care about the end of the world? So cute. Of course I believe in climate change. I call them seasons. And when it comes to pollution, I call that pollution. And folks, obsessing over CO2 emissions in Canada as the only form of pollution is a lot like obsessing over your face acne when you've been diagnosed with bone cancer. Of course, clearing up that acne, buying a Tesla might make you feel good and look good to your peers, but toxic pesticides and the Yellow River in China is going to wipe out organisms on this planet a hell of a lot faster. But Greg, the ozone, the rising temperatures, I can only assume you'd be referring to the official IPCC scientific consensus, right? The scientific consensus to ignore other science and all agree that the world's going to end in 12 years unless we pay the carbon tax. Smells a little off to me. Reminds me of that consensus between celebrities, politicians, and news channels that we just all agree we're not going to talk about the Epstein story anymore. Coincidentally, these same climate science studies have been disseminated about as openly and honestly on mainstream news as the Podesta emails. But hey, don't let me ruin your fairy tale. Let's let Disney Plus and Netflix babysit our children. Let's pay the carbon tax and make believe like we're actually getting something done. Let's let our Canadian ancestors roll in their graves as they watch us lazy, ungrateful Canadians refuse to stand up against pedophiles and communists, because according to our global authority daddy figures and our cult progressive leaders, that is living happily ever after. This is Canada Now. Thanks for watching. Do you think I left anything out? Is it over yet? Jesus.